line, fighting for the truth. With every revelation, we'll uncover the root.
Good day, Canada. Welcome to the show. Now, let's state the obvious. Canada is not the free and democratic country you thought it was. In fact, it hasn't been that way for some time. We saw this in 2022 when Justin Trudeau, a man who constantly lectures the world about democracy, decided to invoke a wartime emergency powers against peaceful truckers. He froze bank accounts, crushed dissent, and called working-class Canadians racist and misogynists for daring questioning his authority. And guess what? The courts just ruled that the entire thing was unconstitutional. Who could have seen that coming? So what's next? Justin Trudeau is stepping down. But the Liberal machine isn't going anywhere. And now there are rumors that are circulating that a successor, maybe Mark Carney, maybe a Chrystia Freeland, maybe another Liberal swamp creature, could use the next big crisis to delay Canada's federal election to 2026. Their excuse? Donald Trump. Specifically, Trump's proposed tariffs, which could be spun into an economic emergency, big enough to justify keeping the Liberals in power. Sounds crazy. Well, so did freezing people's bank accounts. But that happened too. Joining me now is someone who spent his entire career exposing and fighting government overreach, Barry W. Bussey. He's a constitutional lawyer, founder of the First Freedoms Foundation, and the author of 210 Celsius, which documents how the truckers' convoy shook Canada to its core. Barry, thanks for being here.
Great to be with you, Dan.
You know what, Barry, let's break into it. We've seen how the Liberals operate. They love emergency powers. They love bypassing Parliament. They love avoiding accountability. Could they actually use Trump's tariffs as an excuse to delay the election? And if so, how?
Well, okay, so first of all, I think it would be crazy for the Liberals to use the Emergencies Act yet again. But I have no idea what's been happening up in Ottawa, but one can imagine that sitting up there in the Prime Minister's office, there's a group of people who are looking at all kinds of different avenues and different strategies of how they're going to deal with Trump and the proposed tariffs. And one could imagine that there would be some discussion about the Emergencies Act. And the reason why we would think it's possible is because we had that trucker convoy up in Ottawa, and obviously it was not an emergency, as the federal court has already ruled, but it is conceivable that something like this could happen yet again. And again, I don't know what, I don't know, Dan, do you have any kind of inside track as to what, I just find it surreal to think that this would be yet another possibility here in Canada.
I think it was surreal there, Barry, that when protesters' bank accounts were frozen for donating to a convoy. And let's be clear, people that weren't even a part of the convoy, they simply donated, had their bank accounts frozen. So it's not inconceivable that this government might take another step, use an economic crisis. I mean, let's be clear, Barry, they've frozen Parliament. They prorogued it to hold a Liberal leadership race. Would this government use Trump's tariff as an economic emergency? I don't know, but I mean, it is in the realm of possibility, which is why I would love to hear your insights about this.
Okay. So, and of course, the reality is we also have an election now in the province of Ontario on the same basis, right? So here, Premier Ford did not have to call an election at least another year. And okay, so here's the deal. The deal is, first of all, the Constitution allows a government to stay in power, so the federal government can stay in power for a 5-year term. That is the limit, which would take us up into October 26. Now, yes, there is this, legislation has been passed that the next election is going to be October 25, but we already know that the Prime Minister could call an election at any time. And so on. It could be less than October 25. But we know, because of the political reality, he wants to drag it out. He wants to get as much time for his successor. And even though, which is fascinating, and this whole case that's going on right now at the federal court as to whether or not the proroguing of Parliament is indeed constitutional under these circumstances. We're going to see what the federal court says, as there's going to be a hearing coming up on February 13 and 14. However, okay, so you're asking a hypothetical. I'll give you a hypothetical response. I'll give you a response of how it's possible that the government could, in fact, impose invoke the Emergencies Act. And so there are a number of emergencies that's listed in the Emergencies Act as to what can happen if the government so chose to implement the act. And we've already seen the public order emergency, which is one of the four that are listed. There's public welfare emergency, public order emergency, which is where the whole convoy was, the invocation of the act during the convoy. And then there's an international emergency and war emergency. Where would it possibly fit? I think it would possibly fit under Part 3, international emergency. And there you will find, first of all, when the government is to declare an emergency, it has to be considered a situation that is urgent, critical, and that it can't be handled by the existing law. Well, so you got to ask yourself, okay, whether or not the issue of tariffs could be considered something that is urgent, critical, and can't be handled by existing laws. I think there's a very strong argument that it could be handled by existing laws. However, as we have seen on the convoy situation, the government was able to come up with had its lawyers put together a legal brief that said, okay, government, you can go ahead and here's the rationale. Now, what's interesting, we have yet to see that rationale. Even the Public Order Emergency Commission did not get it released. Why? Because the government said, well, there's solicitor-client privilege. Well, I think personally that memorandum needs to be released so we can see exactly what kind of rationale was being used for invoking the act. Is it possible that yet again we could have the government's legal resources put together an argument that says, hey, during a tariff crisis, a financial crisis, that we would have what would be considered an international emergency? And I think it is conceivable. Like, I mean, you can make arguments and justifications and a whole wide of things, and it is possible you could be making these arguments, but whether or not a federal court would say, yes, it is a valid argument, it's going, like, given if Justice Mosley's decision holds up, I think the government will be in a bad way. Plus, we also see the current federal court expediting this prorogation case so that the court is saying, hey, you know what? You need to be holding, possibly the court could say, you need to be holding Parliament and have a discussion, have a debate, and deal with the issue. Okay, so what is interesting, if you look at the act, the Emergencies Act, which is an act that's been around since 1988, and it's an act that says, okay, look, you can have a national emergency is an urgent, critical situation of a temporary nature that, number one, seriously endangers the lives, health, and safety of Canadians, and number two, it seriously threatens the ability of the Government of Canada to preserve its sovereignty, security, and territorial integrity. Then when you go over to Part 3 of the Act, which deals with the international emergency, we get a whole bunch of the abilities that the government would be able to do. And here's what it says: an international emergency. It means an emergency involving Canada or one or more countries that arises from acts of intimidation or coercion or the real imminent use of serious force or violence that is so serious as to be a national emergency. Now, it's still kind of broad, but that's the nature of it. So is it conceivable that if we do get these tariffs from the United States, so you're dealing now with an international relationship that's going on, and it's something that there's an act of intimidation. Could it be perceived by the politicos in Ottawa that this action of Trump is in fact an act of intimidation? Now, notice what happened in the last weekend, last few days, when Trump had two plane loads of illegals from Colombia. He wanted to send them down, and the president of Colombia says, "Oh, no way, you're not going to be sending him down here. You've got to keep him." And Trump says, "Okay, fine. So we're going to impose a 25% tariff. But by the way, if you don't allow us within the next week to send them down, it's going to be 50%. Not only that, we're going to be taking away the visa status of your diplomatic corps here in the United States. We will be putting other sanctions." Within 2 hours, the Colombia president caved in. Okay. So is it conceivable that we could have a really hot economic, perhaps would be considered an act of intimidation, when if the Canadian government says they're going to do what that they're going to hit back and hit back hard at the United States by imposing its own tariffs and its own who knows what against the United States. Like, I mean, even Doug Ford mused about the idea of cutting off the electricity going down to Pennsylvania and New York. Well, what if Quebec decides, with all of its hydroelectricity that it has as a result of the project up in Churchill Falls and its own projects, if it decides, okay, hey, you know what, we're going to cut down the electricity, there's going to be a lot of people in the United States going to hurt. Now, let me tell you, do you think it's possible that Trump will just lay down and say, okay, that's fine, no problem? Because he may very well say, you know what, instead of 25, we're going to do 50, just like we said we're going to do to Colombia. So we're in a zero-sum game going on here, and it's a very dangerous diplomatic thing. Now, just think about it as well. If Canada were to declare a public emergency, in invoking the Emergencies Act yet again, and this time it's going to be centered totally on the relationship with the United States, how do you think that's going to go over with our American cousins on the state side? Like, I mean, you're really upping the ante. And I'm not sure, well, in fact, I think it's common sense. Canada is not going to fare well if this becomes, and like the premier of your province in British Columbia recently said, he's ready to go on an economic war against the United States. Good luck, because I don't see it being a very good situation for Canada. And I think we got to let the air out of the balloon here and recognize that. I noticed, for example, the foreign minister went down to Washington, met with Rubio this week, and I think that's what's got to happen. I think we got to have more and more dialogue. But if we're going to up the ante every time Trump ups the ante, we're just simply going to lose. And here's my problem. My problem is this: a number of things actually, but here's one of the big problems: is that here you have the people in the auto industry in the province of Ontario and Quebec and others that are going to lose big time. I mean, Trump has always said, look, we don't need the cars being made in Canada. I prefer they be made down in Detroit. So it's going to be the people who are on those assembly lines here in this country who may end up losing their houses, because you're going to have this fighting match between, the Trump and Trudeau. And there's going to be real hurt, because if it's anything like what happened during the COVID experience, and we had situations where, as I spoke with the truckers when I was up in Ottawa during the convoy, truckers were telling me that they lost their houses. Some of them were having marriage issues because of the finances that they were going through because of this whole thing. What kind of carnage are we going to have in our own country because politicians are not willing to sit down and try to work out some kind of an arrangement? There needs to be some trading of horses here so that we can get on with the job and fixing the problem that Trump has pointed out, which is the border security and also the fentanyl going down. Okay, so let's make it clear that we're going to do that. Now, on top of that, the prime minister now says, well, okay, just like in COVID, when people lost their jobs, we're going to have the government pay people for when they lose their jobs. Okay, so who's going to pay for that? And what are we going to do when we have a situation that our economy is going to be hurt very badly and is going to be brought to its knees? Where is the government going to get the money? It's going to come from the middle class who end up going to pay for this one-upmanship and this showmanship between the countries. And I think it's unjust. I think it's wrong. And I really hope and pray that we don't even come close to this idea and concept. To me, it will be an absolute failure on the diplomatic sense if we're going to end up invoking the Emergencies Act again. I mean, it's surreal, it's crazy, but it was surreal and crazy the last time they invoked it.
Barry, I think the biggest problem here, and we've seen, I think SNC-Lavalin was the canary in the coal mine with this government. We saw them pushing an attorney general, Joni Raymond Wilson, of to look the other way. So it's not out of the question that this government would do something unreasonable. I mean, I completely agree with you. I think that having this dialogue, I think that we should, rather than say we're going to do a one-for-one tariff, I think that the more reasonable course of dialogue, especially when it comes to the media, is to say, hey, we're securing the border. We're doing that. Obviously, they can't because they prorogued Parliament and they can't fund it. But I mean, there should be a show. And, it almost seems like that they're signaling to their base, we're going to take on Trump. And it's like you said, we have no bearing to do that. I mean, look at, the auto manufacturing. I mean, the U.S. is our biggest trading partner. We do 70% of our trading with the U.S. No other country comes close. I mean, this federal government has basically crippled our energy sector. They've canceled Energy East, Northern Gateway, Bill 69, which is the anti-pipeline bill. It makes it impossible to create a pipeline. We've basically made it so that we're dependent on the U.S. So now they want to say, well, this is a big problem. I mean, this is a problem they created, unfortunately. So my question to you now is, the courts ruled that Trudeau's use of the Emergency Act against the trucker convoy was unconstitutional. Does that set precedent here, and could that prevent future abuse of this power?
Each situation is going to be reviewed by the court with its own context, its own experience. And while it will have some bearing, in that one, you're dealing with the public order emergency. This one is an what I would say, looking at the act, that's kind of where it would fit, the international emergency. I think the courts, the fact that we have a court that was willing to go against the government, I think sets a precedent that, the courts are seriously going to pay attention to this. I think the fact that the federal court is expediting the prorogation case is being brought by the JCCF and those individuals from Nova Scotia. I think that is an indication that the federal court is willing to look into things and to analyze it because, it is of a serious nature. I think, yes, there would be an essence of, a precedence of the court, looking into what the government is doing. Would the court, it all depends how the government reacts on this, what what will they impose? Will they, you know, yeah, like, I mean, when we get into political emergencies, and this will be a serious political emergency, um, we don't know what the political actors are going to do. Uh, Trump has shown himself to be unpredictable, and he's shown himself to be determined. And if he feels that the only way to deal with Canada is to come down hard, just like he did with Colombia, I think that's a precedent. I
Right.
think I think we got to recognize that he could come down hard on us, and then we as Canadians have got to ask ourselves: do we want to be sacrificing our own personal wealth uh, to a political machination that's going on in Ottawa and DC, or do we want our political leaders to sit down and let's come to some kind of a reasonable arrangement? Now, it strikes me that most Canadians would just simply want to live their lives, and they just simply want to go on. And I think it's one of the things that I find very disconcerting is when I read in the newspaper, I read in the in the news columns and so on about people saying, "Oh, if you're willing to allow the United States to come and take over Canada and all, you need to leave the country." Uh, okay, so is that individual who is making those kinds of arguments, are they willing to put their sons and daughters and grandsons and all the rest on the front line to stand up against the United States because you want to take on the U.S.? Like, and by that it could be, yes, a physical war. I mean, God forbid, but it's the economic war that's most probable. And are you willing to pay the price that an economic war will bring? And that's the question that I think that Canadians have got to ask themselves and what they expect. So that when we have a prime minister say, we're going to fight for Canada. Well, where was he fighting for Canada over the last 10 years? Because as you pointed out, we've got all of these pipeline projects that weren't done, the east to west pipeline and so on, because of politics.
Yeah.
The infrastructure of this country has been so damaged that we do not even have the ability to be independent anymore. We're totally reliant. We don't have a manufacturing base. We hardly got we have an agricultural base, but we have so developed our agriculture so that we're not really self-sufficient. I come from Newfoundland originally, and in Newfoundland, prior to World War II and up into World War II, Newfoundlanders were pretty much self-sufficient. My grandparents never had running water until I was, it was into the early 1970s when they had running water. But they were self-sufficient. They had all the crops that they would grow, they would put it in their cellar. They survived, right? They were survivalists. I mean, these were pioneers, as it were, taking it on, whatever the elements gave. And we got lots of elements in Newfoundland, let me tell you, and they survived it generation after generation. But here's the thing. We no longer have that resilience anymore. We no longer have the ability in our country to have people or people who are able to look after themselves because we're not independent. Most kids today grow up thinking that the food comes from the grocery store. They have no concept of where a carrot grows. So the thing is this, that if you're going to fight an economic war, you better have the ability to be independent. And I don't think we're there.
No, absolutely not. And you make a lot of good points about being, self-sufficient. And this is another thing that our government, especially this federal government, has done, and even provincially, like a lot of provinces, has crippled our own manufacturing. Well, they've gone under this guise of this green crusade, and they've embraced these carbon taxes, these regulations, but have they actually reduced the manufacturing? Have they reduced the carbon? Of course not. They've simply offshored it to countries like China, where they don't have labor laws, they don't have the environmental regulations. So what have we really done? It's basically a shell game. And unfortunately, this seems to be the case in point of politics today. I mean, go to look at Canadian Tire. Go look on any shelf. Where is your product made? It's China. Go to Mark's Workwear World and see where your socks are made. China. Go try to find anything outside of those two stores that aren't made out of China. It's impossible. Barry, it's interesting because I've looked at like trying to buy a toaster not made in China, there's one, and it's made in the UK, and it's $300. Meanwhile, like every other toaster is like less than like $180. So it just shows you where we are in our society. We like cheap goods. We want
Yeah.
to pretend that we're green and that we're holistic, but in reality, we're not. I mean, you look at this federal government response to, forest fires. Well, they don't want to do controlled burns because, they don't want to look like, they're not appeasing their green zealots. And, you look at what happened at Jasper, it's a perfect example. And we're
Right.
seeing the fallout of that. You know, let's talk a little bit about yourself, Barry, because I think
Sure.
you're quite inspirational. You've made it your life's work, not your life's work, but you've taken on yourself to, fight for freedom, fight for the Constitution. What inspired you to start the First Freedom Foundation, and what are its biggest victories so far?
Okay, so I tell you what started it was the 21 election. And when the prime minister came out against the unvaccinated and basically treating them as the other, I was like, you got to be joking me. Like, I mean, I don't know if you remember some of the scenes where he's up and he's talking to people and he's saying, I'm going to make sure that, that when you sit at the, or when I sit down on the airplane, that I'm not going to have an unvaccinated person sitting next to me and all of this kind of stuff. And I'm like, where have we heard this before? And I have been, I guess, ever since I was a kid, I've been very much involved in thinking about, reading about, world history and all the rest, and you name it, whether it's from ancient historical moments of all kinds of prejudice from various groups or another, and up into the 18th, 19th, 20th centuries, where you had various dictators rise up and create the other, so that they're the scapegoats as to why the economy is not doing well or that's not doing well. And then, of course, we had the craziness in the 20th century where you had the communist dictators and the fascist dictators and all the rest. And it was all this othering. So when I heard this othering going on in the 21 election, I was like, I mean, I got to say something. I got to do something. And so my doing something was to start up the First Freedoms Foundation, and myself and others. What we wanted to do is to be a voice so that we could just say, "Hey, this is unacceptable. You're stopping free speech. You're going against religious freedom, i.e., conscience." Because I think this is one of the things, right? So many people say to me, okay, well, I may not be religious, but I just, in my heart and soul, could not, take the jab or whatever it is, right? Well, that comes down to one's also the inviolability of the person, where like the government has no business taking my body and doing what they want with it. Like it's just simply wrong. And it's always been, just as Ivan Rand, sorry, in 1953, in a case involving Jehovah's Witnesses and the Quebec government in the Samora decision, said that there were three original freedoms: freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and inviolability of the person. And from those, we get this idea of even in work by Justice Brian Dixon at the Canadian Supreme Court in the 1980s, where he talked about freedom of conscience as a prototypical right. And so it became a great moment, as it were, for me during the whole COVID experience. It was kind of like an aha moment when all of a sudden you got the government really interfering with people's body, as it were, and also dealing with the imposition on religious communities. You could have Costco open, you could have Canadian Tire open, but you couldn't have a church open, And then when I saw all of those police officers, was it 200 police officers that are marching around the church there in Edmonton, I was like, okay, you know what? This is just totally unacceptable. And so that's kind of what got me going on this. And it's always been part of my experience, my career, to be involved in the whole law and religion, religious freedom fight, as it were. I've been at the court, the Supreme Court, I think it was 5 times now as an intervener. And so my practice is one where I do a lot of work for religious communities, nonprofit work, and individuals who are struggling as they're trying to deal, whether it's at their workplace, wherever. But that's kind of been kind of like my raison d'etre, as it were, when it comes to law and religion, religious freedom. I've written a lot of law review articles, edited a number of books on these subjects, and then during the COVID experience, I had some friends of mine say, "Hey Barry, why don't you write on the truckers?" And so I did, and that's the 210 degrees Celsius, the trucker book that I wrote, and so that has been what we've been doing. What we ultimately want to be able to do more so is to be able to take on cases. Right now, we are not a charity. We don't want to be a charity, in part because we want to be able to speak out on political issues, just like I'm doing right now, and not have to worry about charitable status or anything like that. It's just simply, you know what? Sometimes you got to be able to speak, and you got to have a place where you can do so and not worry about government regulation, about meeting the particular guidelines on political activities and so on, even though Canada has widened that up a fair bit with charities. But nevertheless, that's the reason why we are non-charitable. And so we try to do as much work as we can to help people out with respect to these three issues. And and so, it sure looks like we're not going to be without opportunity to be involved in the public discussion and to try to do the best we can to help our fellow Canadians as we navigate through these troubled times.
It's kind of interesting that you brought up the charitable status, the nonprofit status, and that would actually hinder your ability to speak out. I had no idea that. You spoke on your book 210 Celsius, and I'm glad you brought it up because it does cover the impacts of the trucker convoy. What did that movement reveal about Canada's political establishment?
Well, I refer to the establishment as members of the cathedral.
Right.
And by that, I mean, these are the people who are the academics, members of the judiciary, the members of the media, the politicians, and so on, who basically tell us what the narrative is to be. And if you are in the cathedral, all is well. But if you're outside of the cathedral, if you're outside of this group, the establishment, other terms that other people have used over the years are such as the Laurentian elite, meaning those in the Quebec, Toronto, Quebec, Ontario, around the whole, capital region and so on. But it is what it showed is that if any of your listeners have been up to the convoy and you're walking around and you see what exactly is going on. If you remember, it was a time in which people finally said, "Hey, this is fantastic. We can actually talk to people again." There was just this great enthusiasm of finally being able to get out of the lockdowns and being able to be together and just be able to share and be able to experience this whole opportunity to be able to meet people from across the country and all the rest. And then you turn on the news, you read CBC, and there's all about the white racists who were about all of the, remember the Confederate flag, the Nazi flags, and all the rest of it. And you wouldn't know if it was all a bunch of hoodlums and vandals that were roaming the streets of Ottawa and destroying everything. There wasn't a window broken during the convoy, except for when the police came in later on, and they broke everything up and they smashed windows left, right, and center, began trampling people with the horses, and then all the rest of it. So all of this gaslighting that went on came from the narrative that the members of the cathedrals were trying to feed us as to what all was happening, when those of us who were there, we saw indeed the truth of the matter. And I think this is something that it's a takeaway for me. And I'll never forget I was up there I was up there for 2 weekends, and I'll never forget on the second weekend I was up there, was February 13. And I remember there listening to Brian Peckford, and talking about, the Constitution is not just some little municipal law and so forth. It's it is the supreme law of the country, right? Supreme law of the land. And amazingly, we all had no idea as we were there in the crowd that within the halls of power, the government was already lining up as to what they were going to do on Valentine's Day, the very next day, where they were going to send the love of the government to Canadians by imposing the Emergencies Act, freezing people's bank accounts. I have friends whose even their former spouses were walking through the grocery store and trying to buy groceries, and then suddenly their card is not working. I tell you, that really woke people up. And it not only woke people up here in Canada, but it woke people up across the world. A number of people from Australia to UK, you name it, people said, what? Here we have a G7 country that is freezing people's bank accounts because of political opinion, because they're exercising their charter right to go out and protest. Like, I mean, it's insane. Absolutely insane. Anyhow, so that's my thought on the political establishment.
you call it the cathedral, Barry, but I would more call it the Inquisition. You know, and it almost seems like it's politics today has become, some people's religion, and I think we need to take a step back and kind of recognize that we actually need to take more time with our communities, and that's one
Yeah.
thing I will say that I do miss about going to church, going to religion is that you definitely knew your neighbor when you went to church, and
Yeah.
I can't say that many people know their neighbor now, especially when we live in these towers, and it's almost impossible hard not to, or it's almost impossible to know your neighbor because we come from so many backgrounds. Let's go back a little bit about your fight with constitutional freedoms. Is there anything that's like any freedoms that right now we're sleeping on that the government is going after, in your opinion?
Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Right away. I can tell you right now, freedom of religion.
Okay.
And I wrote my PhD thesis on this whole subject. I call it um, the legal revolution against the accommodation of religion. And you can look it up. You just Google my name, do my PhD thesis, and you'll find it. I did it over in the Netherlands, actually, at the University of Leiden, at the law school there. My professor was Professor Paul Cliteur, who's a very well-known academic in the Netherlands and was also very much involved in a lot of political activity over there. He's now retired. But to me, what we have seen develop over the last little while is an attitude amongst the political establishment that religion is a problem and that we can no longer give much in the way of accommodation to religious communities anymore like we used to. I mean, let's face it, Canada was found in no small part as a opposition to the development of what is now the United States of America, right? So we were the refugees of the American Revolution that made their way to Nova Scotia, New Brunswick, the Maritimes. Newfoundland was kind of like out on the edge there. Not too many loyalists came over that way because we were already loyalists, but there was up into Ontario and so on, and parts of Quebec, the southern part of Quebec. And no small part was the reality of the religious understandings of people. So if you look back in the American experience, many of the preachers of the time were, very supportive of, America standing up against what was seen as the arbitrary rule of King George and all the rest. And then Canada developed in its own way and developed its own sense of identity, and religion played a major part of it. And there was the Protestant Catholic divide, which was the English French. So we got religion, we got language, we've got different cultures and so forth that made up what ultimately became Canada. And then it was during the American Revolution, after the American Revolution, that's when John A. Macdonald said, hey, if we are going to keep British North America at all, we're going to have to join together, because you don't know the moment, as he says in one of his famous letters that, by the way, Pierre Elliott Trudeau used in a speech down to I think it was Washington, I think it was in Washington. And he referred to, John A. Macdonald referred to the Yankees, who he said war with Canada and the United States is perhaps inevitable, as those Yankees are going to want Naboth's vineyard. Now, he used a term that is actually a religious term, Naboth's vineyard. Where does that come from? That comes from in the book of Kings, First Kings, in chapter 21, where Naboth has a vineyard next to King Ahab. King Ahab wanted it, and so what does he do? He sends, he ends up, actually, his wife actually kills Naboth, so then the king could take the land. And so the idea that John A. Macdonald recognized, speaking in religious terms that everyone would understand, is that, you know what? The idea of greed, the idea of wanting something else across the fence, right? The grass is always greener on the other side, and we'd like to see what it's like over there. And he said, look, this is what's going to happen. And so then we became a country, and we became with our own sense of identity. You go across Canada, and you'll see in every little village, you'll see all kinds of various churches set up, which are now ghost buildings, because in many ways, Canada's lost its religious fervor and understanding. But nevertheless, religion played an important role in the country. We had religious schools. One of the big fights in the history of Canada was the issue of the Manitoba Schools Act as to whether or not government was going to give money to the schools. We got still in Ontario, we got a little bit of remnant of that, where some of the Roman Catholic schools still get government money, but basically other religious communities don't. Anyhow, the point is, religion played a major role. And now we've come to 2025, and just before Parliament closed down, before Christmas, we had the government make an announcement out of the Finance Committee recommending that the next budget, which is coming up in March, that the next budget take away from the religious communities in the Income Tax Act, that it's known as one of the 4 provisions of charitable purposes. And one of those, known as the third charitable purpose, is the advancement of religion. That is now being recommended to take away. We've seen over and over various places where government has been pushing against religion. We saw it in the Canada Summer Jobs thing and so on. And people say to me, well, Barry, but that's not a religious freedom issue, because it's a right of privilege. It's a privilege that government can give and government can take away. That's true, I agree. But the point of the matter is, the fact that government can do it, or since they can do it, is really a point that people got to recognize. That's what they're after now. Okay, that's what they're after now. But who says they're not going to do something else? We've got a society right now in this country which is doubling down on diversity, equity, and inclusion policies, from government all the way down, private businesses, you name it. And any time that a religious community has a particular view or particular understanding that somehow violates those trifecta of the new paradigm, the new trinity, as it were, of society, they want to say, okay, that is a racist, that is a, you name it, identity of a religious community that should not be acceptable. And so here it is. I gave it to you. I see that religion is the area that government right now is wanting to push back out of the way. But only those religions, I should add, only those religions who do not accept the government's ideology. Those religious groups who accept government ideology, no problem. But anyone else, look out.
It's funny that you mentioned that because you mentioned John A. MacDonald, and it's no wonder they're trying to cancel him. I think in Ottawa they have him boxed, like his statue boxed up, but you know it goes a little beyond that, because I think what's interesting about what you're saying is that they're trying to take the charitable status away from churches, but at the same point in time they're funding NGOs, nonprofits with their DEI ideology. And what do these DEI charities do? Well, they reinforce what the government narrative is. So it's your
Exactly.
tax dollars actually spending money to reinforce what the government is trying to promote. I mean, I definitely don't want my tax dollars promoting that, but here we are in 2025. Barry, I'd like to ask you a little bit. I'd like to ask another question, because it's very important, because you know, I want to make a little bit like, what's your take on Mark Carney right now and Chrystia Freeland in this next election? Like, have you been following this Liberal leadership race?
Yeah, I've been following it somewhat. It's interesting. I was speaking with someone recently from the UK who was sharing with me. He said, Mark Carney is a failed banker from the UK who's caused all kinds of financial struggle over in the UK. Inflation has gone crazy, and there's been a whole bunch of things that he listed off. I have no knowledge of that. I'm just going by what this gentleman shared with me. He's been in Canada for 25 years. He's heading back to the UK and so on. But, it's very interesting that we have a situation where we have to recognize that the Liberal Party has been the party that is, they call it the natural governing party of Canada. Why? Because it has, if you look at its history, it has served probably more time leading the country than it has not serving the country. And in particular, over the last little while, when I say last little while, from the time of Justin Trudeau, we've got a Liberal Party that under Jean Chrétien and Paul Martin was indeed a very fiscally conservative party, very much wanting to see that the country's finances and so forth were going to be on sound footing. We had a prime minister who, did really well. I mean, I have to give credit where credit is due. And Chrétien really, and Paul Martin, they worked hard on getting rid of the deficit and making Canada in a good stead. That was then followed up even further with the Conservative government that came after. Now, the Liberal Party under the Justin Trudeau flag has been very much throwing out all of the past. And even within its own party, it didn't want to listen to any of the old guys from the Liberal past, but that we're going to go on a new venture. We're going to go with the green. We're going to go all of this. And what's happened? We've gone from 600 billion to now, was it 1.2, 1.3 trillion dollars in debt? And Mark Carney has been one of the mentors behind Justin Trudeau, who has been supporting all of the WEF policies, the globalist policies, and all the rest of it. And now they're wanting to crown him king. Well, the thing is that he's only going to be a Trudeau 3.0, and I'm not sure where that's going to take us. As far as Chrystia Freeland is concerned, I just think, I'm sure she's a very well-meaning person, and all the rest of it. But let's face it, she has been the person who has been at Mr. Trudeau's beck and call. And granted, he double-crossed her, as he's done with a host of others in his cabinet. But the reality is, there is no way we can differentiate her either from the policies that have so crippled our country. And now we're at a very vulnerable place in the country's history where we have a country that is being challenged like we are with the United States and the whole tariff thing. And we've got no ability to be able to stand up on it. Now, So anyhow, so that's my sense of it. I
No,
just think we're
no,
in
I
a
mean, and the reason I bring up Mark Carney is because obviously he was involved during the convoy. You know, his name was thrown around by Marco Mendocino to David Lemeni when he said let's bring in the tanks against them. So I mean, he's been in his fingers have been in this for quite a while. You know, and right now it seems like the liberals are kind of adopting what the conservatives have been pushing. Let's axe the tax. Let's, scrap it. Great. And it almost leaves, the conservative party, it kind of takes a little bit of out of their winds out of their sails. My question to you is, what would you say to Pierre Poilievre? Like, what should he campaign on instead? Like, should he be pushing more freedoms, like make our freedoms stronger? Like, what would you like to see from a more like because obviously Pierre Poilievre is pushing a freedom movement, more freedoms for Canada. What would you like to see more freedoms of? Like, what do we need to like more stronger laws on?
well. I think first of all, what needs to happen is that Pierre Poilievre and anyone who's going to be the next prime minister needs to be an individual who's going to um, uh, understand Canadian history, understand the importance of who we are, what we have been about for the last hundred and ever how many years we've been a country since 1867, and recognize that Canadians are looking for somebody who is going to be encourage pride in the country, who's going to be there for Canadians to be able to speak their minds, be able to speak common sense, and being able to have that ability to be able to say to government, look, you're messing up. Do something about it. Make a difference. I think the perfect example, I'm sorry, but I know a lot of people don't like Daniel Smith, but I think Daniel Smith is the person who is saying, look, enough's enough. We're here. We're going to be standing up, and we're going to encourage freedom in this country, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, and all the rest. And we are going to be able to come up with a plan that is going to allow this country to prosper. This country is built, its entire structure has been built on resource extraction. And for the last 10 years, we've had nothing but a demolition of the entire structure of how our economy operates. In the province of Newfoundland, for example, my friends tell me from down there, there's been so much oil that has been discovered off the coast of Newfoundland that it rivals among the largest oil deposits in the world. It's huge, it's massive, and yet haven't been able to touch it. We need a leader that's going to say, hey, you know what? We're here for Canadians. We're here for Canada. We're not here because of some international body over in Davos, Switzerland, tells us that this is what the policy ought to be here in North America. No, we need to recognize that as Canadians, we are a peace-loving people, but we're also no pushover. We are a people who want to be able to go out and make a strong economy, be individuals who are resilient. We're not resilient. We need to be resilient in whatever we have to face as a country. And that means we have to look around us and we have to say, hey, you know what? We need to be working together. We need to stop this foolishness of saying you're unacceptable because you're from a different identity or you're from a different people group or you're all the rest of it. We are all Canadians. We're not all of these various markers that the Marxist ideologues have come up in the halls of academia that have now permeated through the political establishment and have been taken over the various institutions of the country. And we need to say, no, look, this is unacceptable. We are a country that encourages freedom, freedom of thought, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of conscience, freedom to be able to go wherever it is we want to go in this country and to be able to make a life instead of being a country that is going to be frightened to death because we're going to light a match and have a candle, and that's somehow is going to end our lives as a civilization. This is craziness.
You know, Barry, I've been listening to you for like the past hour, and one thing that I find very remarkable is your courage to stand up against this government. And, you know, not a lot of people would do that. Let's be honest. It takes someone very different that would stand up to authority, to, you know, the powers that be, because let's be clear, it's the books are stacked against you. What keeps you motivated, like in to keep the fight going? Like what motivates you?
Well, I tell you what motivates me. Listen, I've come to a point, early in my days when I ran for politics. I ran for Canadian Alliance back when Stockwell Day was the opposition guy, opposition
I
leader.
like
And
Stockwell.
yeah, and I must admit that in those days I was always frightened to death about what I was going to say and what I was going to do. And so, you're always at a point. But now, this is now 25 years later, and I'm now at a point in life where I'm at my Clark Gable moment in my life stream, where Clark Gable says, frankly, my dear, I don't give a. And that's exactly where I am, because the time has come. Look, I've got grandkids now. I tell my wife, I can't believe I'm married to a grandmother. She's a very beautiful grandmother, by the way. And but she says, well, I'm married to a grandfather, uh, and who's getting grayer and grayer every day. But here's the point. The point is this: I've got nothing else to lose. I mean, I've lived, well over half of my life. I mean, I'm coming up towards the end of my runway. But the point is this: what kind of a country are we going to leave for my grandkids?
Right.
And that's why I speak up. I speak up because of my grandkids. I speak up because I've had a life where I have made personal decisions on my own religious faith. Where yeah, the Bible actually makes a lot of sense, and it's something that I spend time in, and I try to do my best to follow the two great commandments: love the Lord your God with all your heart, but love my neighbor as myself. And that's where I stand. And it just motivates me to just say, hey, you know what? I have to speak my mind. And so, in many ways, First Freedoms Foundation is one of those ways in which I'm able to do that. And we're all human. We all make mistakes. We're all going to say something that, oh, you know what? I shouldn't have said this. Maybe I was a little bit too. My wife says to me all the time, Barry, sometimes you're way over opinionated. Perhaps if you could just calm it down a little bit. And I take her counsel very seriously, because I think she's the one who kind of keeps me on the wraps and tells me, that if I've overstepped my bounds or whatever. But I'm also like, in many ways, I look at history and I look at the great thinkers and the philosophers and the theologians and many of the great minds that are out there. And they have been people who are willing to be able to speak up. Now, speaking up has a cost, right? Because people don't necessarily like people who have strong opinions. But anyone who meets me would recognize that, you know what? I thoroughly enjoy people, and I love hearing their stories, and I love having an opportunity to sit down. If I had a perfect world, I'd be down in my garden in the summertime, and I'd have a whole bunch of people over, and we just sit down and have a cup of tea, and let's just have a chinwag about life, about our stories, and all the rest. That keeps me going. My grandkids keep me going. My wife keeps me going. My faith keeps me going. And my country, and I pray to God that we wake up, will keep me going as well. And but I will say this: I am not one who's interested in seeing my fellow Canadians suffer because politicians do not take the time to sit down and have a conversation and try to resolve issues in a commonsensical way, instead of trying to be puffed up and try to impress people how powerful they are, when all you have to do is look around and recognize, guess what? We're not all that powerful. And so, it tends to be wise. Scripture says that a man who understands the limits of his days gains much wisdom. And a leader that understands and is humble enough to recognize that he's not perfect and understand the situation that he finds himself, that, you know what, that gains a lot of wisdom, and to ensure that people are not going to suffer because you make a dumb political decision.
Barry, I mean, I think you're absolutely right. I think that, the time of, tribal politics is over. I think that we need to kind of, go back to, let's get rid of this post-national state that Trudeau has come up with. Canada has an identity, and let's be clear. It's like you said, we were the solution to, the US, their antithesis. You're talking about your family. My family, I can trace my lineage back to Plymouth Rock, if you can believe that. So it's a long, long time. So we do have a history, we do have values, and to say that we don't is I think that it's a disservice to to everyone that's listening to here. Barry, I want to ask you one last thing.
Yep.
What do you say to those Canadians that are, they're feeling hopeless right now? What do you say to those people that, they're just listening to it on their phones? What can we say to those people? Because obviously they can do more. They need to do more. Just being on Twitter is not enough. What do you say to those people? What do they need to do to be more involved, to make this government more accountable?
Well, so I would say, first of all, uh, every single person in this country has value. Every person in this country has influence. Every person in this country has a possibility to change the world for the better. Every single one. And the thing is this: we all live in our own little world. We have our friends, we have our neighbors, and we all can make life better for each other. And we can all help one another. One of the things that really is a takeoff, and why I think that the truckers, I say 16 ways the truckers um, basically, are here for the long haul, made changes for the long haul, is because even now, these 3 years, or ever how many years it's been, what is it, 3 years, 3 years coming up, there are still people meeting today in small groups around the country from that experience. And the thing is that as you're in your own little group and you're giving one another the benefit of the doubt, and you're willing to listen to people who have a different opinion than yourself, you're making a difference, and you are going to, in essence, save Canada. We need to have people who are being humble enough to recognize that they don't have all the answers. I certainly don't have all the answers. I just, part of my makeup, I guess, and I think I get this from Newfoundland as well. In Newfoundland, like my father, for example, my grandfather, they didn't have much in the way of a lot of training necessarily, but what they had was um, the Jewish people have a term, and I don't know if I'm saying this right, but it's chutzpah, has the ability to just, have the pluck, as the English would say, to get out there and make it happen, even when you get knocked down. And Newfoundlanders tend to have that capability. And even though we don't know everything, we nevertheless try. Like, I have a good friend of mine who hired my son. He was from Newfoundland. He hired my son. He had these huge, massive, those large motor coaches for a bus, right? And so my son was hired working with my friend, and he his job was to clean the coach and wash it down for the next trip it was going to take on some cross country tour or whatever. And then so he came into the shop and he says to my friend, he says, "Dennis," he said, "I got it done. It needs to be moved." And Dennis says to him, "Move it." Well, I said, "I've never moved a truck like that before." Well, he says, "It's time to learn." And so he got my son up into the bus, and so my son has no training, but here he is. He's in this big, massive parking lot where all the buses are, and he he gives my son the ins and outs of how you start it up and how you drive it, and then he left them. And my son was so scared. He said to me, "Dad, you know what?" He said, he said, every time I would just move the bus, like maybe a couple of feet, I would get out, turn, go walk to the back, make sure I knew where I was and all the rest. Well, you know what? Within a week, he was driving around the parking lot, moving the buses after they'd been cleaned, putting into the place, backing them in, all the rest of it, because he didn't. And that was part of the attitude. And so the thing is this: if we want Canada to be a better country, if we want Canada to survive, then just do it. Just go ahead, do it, make it happen.
It's interesting. I love that story, Barry, because I think, this would be another hour of us having a conversation. The participation ribbons. We don't teach this generation how to fail, and we don't teach them that failing is actually a good thing. And I think that comes a lot to what you're saying is people don't know how to try because they're too afraid of failing. And obviously, I think that would be an entire another podcast. So I
Yes.
love that story. Barry, I really do appreciate you spending an hour with me today.
Yep.
Where can people find you and follow your work?
Sure. Just go to firstfreedoms.ca and encourage you to sign up for our newsletter. I try to send out a newsletter once a week, mentioning some cases, I'll have some interviews. I have actually a tea time with Barry that I've just started up, just kind of shooting off my mouth about the various events that's happening. And yeah, so I encourage you to sign up there. I do have a bunch of my writings on there on that website, but I'll have writings all over the place. I'm kind of like the mice, wherever I go, there's droppings. So there's all kinds of articles, op-eds, law review articles, books I've been involved with, which I've very much enjoyed doing some academic work on these kinds of issues.
Barry, thank you for joining us this evening. This is exactly the kind of conversation Canadians need to be having right now, because we know how this playbook works. First, they manufacture a crisis. Then they declare an emergency. And suddenly, democracy is optional. We saw it with the trucker convoy, and we could see it again. If you want to understand how the government weaponized power against its own citizens and how people fought back, go check out Barry's book, 210 Celsius, 16 Ways the Truckers Ignited Canada for the Long Haul. It's a must read if you care about freedoms and where this country is headed. Barry, thanks again. We'll be watching what happens next.
Well, thank you very much, Dan. I appreciate it.
All right, Barry. Thank you.